Welcome everyone to this ACUR at ANU student presentation session, Dark Histories, Critical Eyes. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we meet and pay respects to the elders past and present. My name is Aidan Delaney and I'll be chairing today's session. I'd like to introduce our next presenter, which is Rachel Tansuwin. So if you'd like to start when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Rachel and my presentation seeks to discuss the importance of authentic and culturally appropriate consultation with Aboriginal communities as opposed to the common formulaic consultations that often ignores Aboriginal voices. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waters of the Adelaide Plains on which I stand on. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'll first start off with an Aboriginal artwork regarding the importance of consultation by Mandy Nicholson, which symbolizes a camp with its campfire smoke. It illustrates an invitation to come and gather here in this place and represents a place for Aboriginal communities to talk. The symmetrical lines are unique to southeastern Australia and represent the different journeys taken by different Aboriginal groups to end up at the same place to gather information. This artwork is a pivotal description of holding genuine consultations among Aboriginal communities, preserving their customs and traditions. As an international student from Malaysia, I am aware of the legacy of colonialism and the negative impacts that derive from it. Aboriginal peoples and their generations in Australia has effectively been silenced even until today. Nonetheless, there is a major gap in this area in terms of research. One of the important roles of the law reform class at the University of Adelaide is to research and work on law reform projects. This topic is an example of my work in the law reform class. This is an outline for my presentation. My methodology for this research goes beyond Western sources and extends to sources by Aboriginal communities. I refer to Indigenous sources and interviews from Aboriginal organizations such as the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, international sources from New Zealand and Canadian cases, Australian government and non-government guidelines such as health and mental health organizations regarding Aboriginal consultations, publications and guest speakers from the South Australian Law Reform Institute, and lastly, cultural and historical multidisciplinary sources and publications. I will begin with a quote by Justice Michael Kirby, a former judge of the High Court of Australia and the founding director of the Australian Law Reform Commission, pioneered in the 1970s. Justice Kirby vitally believed and emphasized the importance of law reform, moving beyond lawyers, judges, and experts. He argued that law reform is not just for governments and highlights the importance of reaching out, involving, and including your community. Upholding Justice Kirby's view, people like you and me should do our part in ensuring that traditionally overlooked people, such as Aboriginal communities in Australia, are not forgotten. This topic is significant as it establishes a stepping stone in countering the effects of colonialism in Australia and an opportunity to provide a meaningful voice for Aboriginal communities. For centuries, Aboriginal communities face injustices and their relationship with Australia has strained and broken. I believe that the first step is to recognize their struggles and hardships they suffered. If these principles of good governance are practiced, we will be one step closer to building a modern essential practice of consultation and reviving a long-term relationship with Aboriginal communities in Australia. Consultation with Aboriginal communities are important for reconciliation and the development of policies in Australia. This includes environmental issues, burial disputes, succession law, and so on. However, consultations with Aboriginal people are often full of misunderstandings in the procedure, poor communications between consultant and Aboriginal communities, and as stated by an elder, there's just no real understanding from people. Consultation practices with Aboriginal people in Australia are unfortunately perfunctory and serve the purpose of procedural compliance. For instance, the fly-in, fly-out method where government personnel charter planes, fly into Aboriginal communities, carry out consultation for a few hours, and then fly back out or go to a local 4-star hotel. This indicates that the government is very removed from the community. Consultations are also rushed, especially with Aboriginal people living in rural areas, and hurried consultations are insufficient for trust and relationship building. Even if consultations are carried out, the outcome often does not acknowledge or accommodate to their concerns or their opinions. As disclaimed by an elder, that always happens and we always get left out. The lack of honest consultation is an example of a major policy failure in Australia, as there is an absence of legitimate and effective long-term engagement with Aboriginal communities. Ultimately, these problems lead to consultation fatigue, where Aboriginal communities get disengaged and weary, driving them away from participating from further consultation. This also creates distinctions between other individuals and Aboriginal communities, and the trust with Aboriginal communities remain fragmented. Legally sound consultation is governed by the Gunning Principles, propounded by Mr. Stephen Sedley and adopted in 1985 in R and Brand London Borough Council case. The Gunning Principles have widely been followed in the United Kingdom and in Australia. Number 1 shows the obvious point where the decision maker cannot consult on a decision that's already been made. Number 2 means that consultees should be told on what topics will be considered. And number 3, enlists that decision makers should decide on the appropriate time period for consultation exercise in issue. Number 4 emphasizes that information resulting from the consultation must be comprehensively, accurately, and properly considered before enacting a policy or making a decision. While these principles provide valuable consultation framework, this leads to my question. Are these consultation principles effective, sufficient, and practical for consultation with Aboriginal people in Australia? The short answer is no. The Gunning Principles were solely tailored by Anglo-Saxon beliefs and for non-Aboriginal communities. This imposes a restricted model for Aboriginal communities, as Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people hold different priorities, expectations, level of commitments, and implementation frameworks. These principles inadequately cater to their diverse and specific customary laws. Thus, it is important to be conscious of the differences between these two cultures, their ways of viewing the world, and how they determine what effective consultation encapsulates. To reframe a meaningful consultation framework, Australia can refer to the progressive initiatives taken by New Zealand and Canadian governments regarding consultation with their First Nations people. New Zealand suggests that a person must act reasonably, honorably, and in good faith in its dealings with the Maori people. This means taking initiatives to understand their history and create a relationship based on trust, respect, and cultural understanding. For instance, involving Maori people with honest and continuous information changes where they can provide real input. The Canadian government enlisted the duty to consult First Nations people in the landmark ruling of Haida Nation case in 2004. The government emphasized that meaningful consultation should be proponent-led, consisting of a robust, thorough, well-planned, diligently executed, and well-documented consultation. Consultation should not be a one-size-fits-all process and must consider the different factors of interest according to the specific values of each First Nation. Imposing an overall policy does not promote equality and fairness to their diversity. Consultations must listen and understand their history, creating a genuine relationship with them. There is no single model that defines honest and respectful consultation, and partnering closely with Aboriginal communities in Australia to determine what promotes their well-being, beliefs, and traditions are crucial. But one of my key findings are to acknowledge and recognize the continuing legacy of colonialism and validate the injustices and negative repercussions they have and still endure. An Aboriginal from Port Pirie said, "Thank you for actually listening to us." This indicates that honest and respectful consultation with Aboriginal communities need to uphold sincere listening, one that goes beyond securing sufficient deadlines. This does not mean imposing fixed questions, checklists, and predetermined solutions to them, but allowing them to freely talk about their goals, problems, and recommendations. Conversations should not be patronizing or abrasive, but interactive, intentional, and continuing. It must be engaged before, during, and after consultation in reciprocal two-way dialogue with an interest-based approach. This will build a strong foundation of reliability and integrity. There is a twofold benefit in upholding honest and respectful consultation, according to Justice Marshall Neave, former judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria. Neave argues that the direct input provides genuine voice and cultural input, ensuring an outcome that considers the cultural beliefs and opinions of judicially marginalized communities. She emphasizes that public participation creates wide civic conversion and engagement, social justice and democracy, which ultimately reinforces the community's trust in the rule of law and in legal institutions, which has long been the center of criticisms and stereotypes. This presentation concludes that law reform and policy is not just for lawyers, experts, and governments, but for people like you and me. The guiding principles for legally sound consultation are insufficient and inadequate for Aboriginal communities. We need to discard the tokenistic consultation with Aboriginal communities by developing and applying honest and respectful guidelines. It is not my intention to impose solutions, but rather suggest some guiding principles that we can adopt in providing effective and meaningful consultation with Aboriginal communities in Australia. It is vital to remember that consultation is solely to seek Aboriginal people's voice, knowledge, and opinions. I recommend that consultation show real—
Sorry, that brings us to time, so I'll have to end the presentation there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation though. So we now have 5 minutes available for Q&A. So I'll begin by again inviting the judges if you have any questions.
I went first last time, Natalia. Do you want to go first if you've got a question?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, oh, who should go first? Again, another exceptional presentation, Rachel. That was a fantastic effort, and I think an incredibly timely and incredibly relevant area of research for you to be investigating. I think it's superb. I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can. I think the ideas of consultation, of honest and genuine and appropriate consultation, is certainly something that parallels a number of the foundations of effective participatory design research, and something that I hold quite close to my own heart with my own practice. But I'm wondering if you could comment on whether or not you have personally perceived, or if you could speculate on potential obstacles between the consultation and genuine action being taken. I think historically we've had a number of examples where even if consultation hasn't been appropriate, consultation has happened, and then other things have kind of stalled progress from happening. And I'd just be interested on your thoughts on that.
So like on the obstacles that might come in the way?
Yeah.
Honestly, I feel like there's so many things that I could say, but I know it's a really complex situation because different Aboriginal groups in Australia have different customary laws. But I think what my whole idea is just that for consultants like us, or like government personnel who want to gather information, for example, in mining disputes or in land disputes and stuff like that, that they should actually just be genuine, I think, and just be honest in asking them what their thoughts are and how they want things to be, because ultimately they are the experts of their own lives and we cannot dictate what to do. So I would see there are many obstacles that may come from everything that's happened in the past and in history. There are things that are bound to happen, but I feel like they recognize if people like us or the government actually take an initiative to actually talk to them and to actually understand what is it that they are looking for, and to understand that they have actually been through a lot and that all they want to is just to be heard. So yeah, but does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask just one more quick one before I hand it over to Nick. But again, I think your presentation has really highlighted the importance of these conversations. And in that previous reply, you've reiterated that further. A bit of a big question. It does need a detailed answer. But why do you think these genuine consultations aren't happening in the first place?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think mainly because it is actually complex. It's not just a one size fits all. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to do that. Because for example, if you fly into a rural area in South Australia and you want to have a consultation with them, you need to spend a little bit of money. You need to spend a lot of time living with the people there and creating a relationship with them. And I just feel like if you do not have that passion, you would think of it as a chore in a way, that you just don't feel like you need to do that. Or you're just like, all right, okay, I've been there, I've done the consultation and I'm out. But that doesn't work. So I think that's one of the biggest things. So if you have like a passion, obviously it would be something that you like, but if not, then you just feel like it's a waste of time, I would think. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Natalia. I'll just check, Aidan, is there time for one more question?
Yeah, we're good.
Cool. I'll just start by echoing Natalia. Rachel, that was a really fantastic presentation. And again, like Ginger Rhodes, you've done a lot of obviously thinking and reading and analysis here. Like it's just really rich, full of really important stuff. I also have a lot of questions, but I can't ask them all. I'm just interested though, you put a table up of comparing what they did in Canada and New Zealand as well. And I found that really useful. And obviously because you've only got 10 minutes, you can't go into too much detail of that. But I'm wondering, in terms of the similarities, I'm sure you've probably looked at them in more detail. Is there anything that stands out in their approaches that there's something that we really need to adopt, like something that stands out from sort of the most important, do you think, that they're doing, or maybe their approaches also need some tweaking perhaps?
Yeah, I think there are so many things that I could say, but I think the biggest one is formally recognizing that they are the First Nations people, especially in Australia, like in the Constitution, and making a formal apology to the different groups in South Australia, for example, like for starters, and then to the whole wider Australian community, because I feel like that's something that they need, like just to recognize the injustices that they faced in the past and know that the current government can't go back to the past and change things, but they can make right the wrong that has happened. So they could try to build a stronger relationship with them right here. And I think that's the biggest thing that I would wish for. And I think that's something that they want to as well. Consultations aside.
Sorry to interrupt. That does bring us to time, so we might just finish on that point. But thank you for that presentation. We really appreciate it. Okay, so we'll now move on to our final presentation for today's session. So I'd like to invite Arabella Hall, if you'd like to begin when you're ready.
Easy. Just while I get started, if I can do this, I wanted to acknowledge and celebrate that didn't work as much as I would have liked. Sorry. To the screen. Oh, it's not letting me share my screen. Interesting.
Perhaps email or if you use Google Drive or something.
I wouldn't know how. Could I possibly email it to someone?
You could try. I think given time, are you able to present without the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so sorry about that, guys. It worked earlier today, but it doesn't like my system preferences apparently and won't let me edit them. So I guess I'll just begin with my acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. I want to pay my respects to the diverse elders of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and I want to recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. And I also want to take this opportunity to foreground that some of the content of this presentation may be triggering to some people, so please don't hesitate to prioritise your mental health if this proves the case. And on that note, we'll start the presentation. So the archive constitutes a well-established site of immense political power, yet its involvement in the legitimisation of the logics and operations of racial privilege have proved difficult to disrupt, leading many to despair at their persistence. Since its inception in the 1970s, critical race theory has laboured to see such institutionalised racism, both acknowledged and condemned. Critical race theory refers to the body of scholarship engaged in the establishment of racial justice through the critical consideration of racial discourses and approaches to racism across diverse disciplines. Underpinning its polemic as well is the concept and subversion of white privilege. Derek Bell, a founding father of critical race theory, pays particular attention to the ongoing legacies of racism despite the apparent illusion of progress. Our careers, even our lives, are threatened because of our colour, writes Bell. What we designate as racial progress is not a solution to the problem. It is a regeneration of the problem in a particularly perverse form. Certainly, the legacies of racism and colonialism continue to exert their influence in an Australian context, though it has become increasingly apparent that the recognition of and responses to these legacies are often incongruent and insufficient. In their applications of critical race theory, Aileen Morton-Robinson, Lisa Cahill, and Natalie Harkin consistently hail Indigenous scholarship and voices as uniquely qualified for the interruption of problematic practices of knowledge production premised on and invested in white privilege. Based on Morton Robinson, Hall and Harkin's contributions to critical race theory, this presentation critically examines Claire G. Coleman's 2017 novel Terra Nullius insofar as it represents a rupturing insertion into Australia's colonial archive, which markedly infers it with possibilities for empowerment and healing. For Morton Robinson, the subversive potentials of Indigenous studies lie not only in its ability to disrupt cultural scripts around racialized identity, but also, and perhaps more importantly, around white identity and privilege. Morton Robinson highlights how white privilege is ingrained in society to such an extent that its operations often go unnoticed by those who benefit from it. Yet for Indigenous peoples, white possession is not unmarked, unnamed, or invisible. It is hypervisible. In fact, it's Indigenous peoples and their voices, histories, and cultures that go unspoken and become invisible in the enactment of white privilege. Coleman's Terra Nullius, then, is a productive site for critical race theory's designs for racial justice, insofar as it functions as a call for reflection that atypically hails its white readership to acknowledge their ongoing role in colonialism and its narratives. The familiarity of Coleman's colonial narrative is punctured by a recasting of roles. Coleman's colonizers are not the white English populations of the history books, but rather a group of toad-like alien colonizers referred to simply as settlers. One of Terra Nullius's most poignant passages comes when Jackie, an Indigenous child, saves Johnny, a settler's life, much to Johnny's confusion. Did the natives fail to draw that line, asked Johnny, the important line that had driven Johnny's life, that defines all settlers' lives, the line between us and them. In her recasting of roles, Coleman demands that her readership, her white readership, empathize and identify with multiple subjectivities, and in doing so, she blurs the line between us and them that is demanded by the white logics of cultural difference. In this way, Terra Nullius's insertion into the domain of colonial narratives is at once a portrait of the prevalence of white privilege in Australia, but also an example of the subversive potentials that Morton Robinson identifies within Indigenous scholarship. Hall further Morton Robinson's exegesis of critical race theory through her exploration of the genealogy of knowledge production. Hall highlights how particular sites of knowledge production limit the types of knowledges that are perceived to be valuable. And in doing so, she identifies the Academy as one such site of knowledge production that is problematic, insofar as its structures of reward and support are thoroughly individualist and premised on racist, sexist, and colonialist norms. In view of this, she calls for the diversification of sites of knowledge production to include ones which aims exceed beyond those of the Academy alone. It is politically and spiritually essential, writes Hall, to support robust ecosystems of knowledge production emanating from imperatives of survivance, resurgence, and recovery that may overlap but exceed the Academy's aims. Certainly, Terra Nullius presents such a site of knowledge production in its efforts to disturb its readership's attachment to colonialist cultural scripts of white sovereignty that in no way account for its legacies of cruelty, violence, and displacement. Coleman's presentation of the media response to Jackie's escape from the mission plainly shows how knowledge is produced around Indigenous peoples that not only denies them the right to respond, but that is also implicitly formulated to further the aims of those generating it. Opinions were divided, some seeing Jackie as a scourge, seeking endorsement to exterminate the entire native race, using him as an excuse, writes Coleman. The other opinion was what worried the department most, some commentators calling for the emancipation of all natives. If Jackie Jaramonga showed such initiative, such a desire to be free, maybe they were people after all. These responses to Jackie's escape seek then not simply to silence Indigenous peoples, but to outright control the plots of their lives. And thus, Terra Nullius once again illustrates the pronounced need to elevate Indigenous voices within sites of knowledge production. Harkin considers the archive as a position poised for the denaturalization of harmful cultural scripts via the means of narrative agency, something that has been historically denied to Indigenous peoples. Coleman too is sorely conscious of the repression of Indigenous voices and details as much in her author's note, which reads, Terra Nullius was influenced both shallowly and deeply by Indigenous Australian survival narratives and works of post-colonial historical fiction. Indeed, in Coleman's own word, the inclusion of epigraphs in her novel constitute an attempt to reproduce the feel and content of the assorted texts written about Coleman's people in the past. The multitude of texts drawn on to formulate these epigraphs then testify to the relentless production of knowledge around and about Indigenous peoples that often sidelines or entirely fails to take Indigenous perspectives into account. Harkin then also draws important attention to the types of responses that are generated by the violence of the archive and the differences in productivity and purpose implicit therein. These history as battleground debates mainly played out between male white historians, writes Harkin, are politically and ideologically stimulated, centered on empirical data, and continue to omit Indigenous voices. Harkin's identification of yet another prolonged silencing of Indigenous peoples then becomes an insistence on the capacity of Indigenous voices to reveal a powerful legacy of silent stories of dispossession and oppression, but also intelligence, refusal, and activism. Ultimately, Terra Nullius's presentation of the damning ways knowledge is produced and circulated around Indigenous peoples not only further substantiates the violence of Australia's colonial archive, but it also exemplifies the empowering potentials that Harkin situates within this very same archive. Bell's postulations on the illusion of progress and its dangerous capacities to conceal the ongoing legacies of racism, featured at the beginning of this presentation, are lifted from his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. Indeed, consistent efforts to sustain racial privilege certainly point to the permanence alluded to in this book's subtitle. Yet as we've seen, Indigenous scholarship and voices have been consistently hailed as uniquely qualified for their interruption by the likes of Morton Robinson, Harkin and Hall. And Terra Nullius then functions as both an attestation to and exemplification of their insistence on the elevation, encouragement and production of knowledge by Indigenous peoples. And consistent across their contributions is the promotion of the subversive potentials of Indigenous voices. And Terra Nullius can certainly be read as a unique and important proponent of such approaches. Indeed, Coleman's insertion into Australia's colonial archive is one that does markedly infer it with potentialities for healing and empowerment in direct contradiction to its heretofore rhetoric of ordained silence. And thus, Terra Nullius unequivocally substantiates just how crucial the promotion and encouragement of Indigenous voices are to addressing Australia's enduring confrontations with racial injustice. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. So we'll now move to, we have 5 minutes for Q&A again. So once again, I'll invite the judges if you have questions.
Thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Arabella. That was, again, like 3 really great detailed presentations. And kudos to you for doing that without slides. You did a fantastic job. You really did. So well done. Also have lots of things we could discuss if we only had more time, but I'm just curious from your perspective, if you had, obviously, I imagine the research project you're working on will wrap up at some point, but I'm curious to know where you would sort of go next. Now that you've looked through, have this insight from Terra Nullius, is there anything else that has come up during your process that you think would be important to look at next to enrich the discussion further?
One of the things, thank you for your question, first of all, Nick. One of the things I found really interesting was actually Harkin's point that even when the violent silences of Australia's colonial archive are acknowledged, the responses and the terrains that these responses emerge out of are so limiting. So I think a really important and crucial next step would be to broaden and diversify sites of knowledge production, but also the sites where the responses to, you know, a previous site of knowledge production, you know, deciding where that then leads to, where we're going to spark the conversation next. And one really interesting way, and it was actually Harkin who launched this project, was through archival poetry. And something she terms as archival poetics, in which she takes texts and then blacks out certain parts that she thinks don't reflect Indigenous voices accurately. And in doing so, she kind of, you know, writes her own narrative out of those that are already there. So I think there are a lot of different avenues, both scholarly and otherwise, wherein this question could be addressed in some really cool ways.
Fantastic, thank you.
Again, as Nick has said, another absolutely sensational presentation, and again, echoing the sentiment, those slides are necessary. That was a gripping presentation even without them, so congratulations on that. My question is perhaps one that I want to offer to you more personally, and I think when we have these conversations about the significant energy that is required to challenge and then transform sites of knowledge, but also cultural perception and ideology, and then all of the reform that that could potentially lead to. These conversations often come with the awareness that it is going to take a lot of energy and such significant amounts of resilience as well. And so I'm wondering if there's any words of encouragement that you either received or that you have developed yourself during this honours process that you would offer to somebody else in order to maintain the energy and dedication that is needed to keep this discussion going.
It's actually really funny because Aileen Morton Robinson, one of the pillars of my theoretical framework, was actually recognised as the ANU's Indigenous Alumna of the Year, I think yesterday, maybe the day before, I forget. But and she, as part of that, was briefly interviewed, and she had some really encouraging words about bringing your knowledge to the table, and I suppose just letting it speak for itself despite previous connotations of value, despite, you know, all these things which, though we can acknowledge and kind of see the real world effects of how those kind of knowledges not being as valued as they should is so damaging. But I think she was just really encouraging in establishing that this is a field that is important, that has real world applications, and that Indigenous peoples won't stop, like, you know, refuse to be so continuously sidelined. And it was just really cool. So I would encourage anyone to have a look at that if they can. And yeah, she's really awesome. So just anything that she's done, it was such a joy to look into her work. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, that's the last question from me.
Thank you.
Well, we have about 20 seconds remaining if anyone has some really quick comments or thoughts.
Just fantastic job to all three of you. Even though it's undergraduate conference, if you didn't know it was undergraduate conference, you just think you're all fantastic researchers. So keep it up and keep spreading your great research, because it was really fantastic. Thanks for allowing us to listen today.
Excellent, thanks for that. Well, I'll sort of echo Nick's comments and say congratulations to all of our student presenters for that session. That does bring us to the end of this session, but I hope that you'll all see some of the other sessions that are remaining tomorrow in the conference. I'd like to thank our judges, Natalia Gulbranson-Diaz and Nick Bedalovich, sorry. Yeah, again, congratulations and thank you to our student presenters, and the recording from the session will be available online following the conference. So thank you, everyone.